I'm your host, the guy in the sweater who asks all the obvious questions. Now, here to tell us about his astounding product for making cupcakes, all the way from Cheshire, England, please welcome...
Me. Hello. Just a heads up, this video was written before the release of No Way Home. From what I've heard, it's pretty good and feels like a bit of an exception to some of the rules that I set out later in this, but I still think they apply to the MCU as a whole. Anyway, what has happened to the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Today it's omnipresent, having grossed over $23 billion from its films alone, which is more than double that of the next biggest franchise in Star Wars. Yes, we should consider inflation and other factors that have distorted that figure, but saying that it's twice as big as Star Wars benefits my point, so I'm going to roll with it. Either way, it's something that would have seemed impossible back at the dawn of the franchise, and that kind of dominance in pop culture is pretty much unrivaled since the dawn of the blockbuster back in the mid to late 70s. The films have a defined structure and style, so you go to the cinema more or less knowing what to expect from the next 2 hours or so. And thanks to that established identity and the sheer overwhelming popularity that has likely changed the fabric of the cinematic medium for the next eternity, there exists a lot of praise and a lot of criticism that both fly around in the chaotic whirlpools of bitter rivalries and acrid fan bases that inevitably arise from discussing the highest earning franchise in the history of film. Some argue that the formula is perfect and that every release is utilising the greatest CGI techniques and technology, as well as the biggest names in the industry, to produce masterpiece upon deserving masterpiece, having cracked the code to creating genuinely exciting, interesting, action sci-fi cinema. Others argue that we've now had 13, soon to be 14 years of the same superhero nonsense, and that the franchise has always been too predictable to offer anything interesting. Because every film has followed the template set by Iron Man's snarky tone as it was developed back in 2008. And although it's of course subjective and there are no right answers, those opinions are both very wrong. Fact. In this video, I'll be looking at the history of the MCU, which I'm dividing into 4 stages, which are different to the phases that the franchise itself uses to guide us through its formidable number of entries. So beware of pretty light spoilers for the general trajectory of the MCU.
I'm so excited!
And let's take a look at Stage 1, Finding Its Feet. Stage 1 starts, of course, with 2008's Iron Man, the first film in what would later become the MCU, which is significant as its pole position and the style of its protagonist would, in one way or another, go on to define most of the first 2 stages. But at the time, Iron Man was just a really fun film. It embraced its style pretty much perfectly, traversing that line between the super serious superhero style of Nolan's Batman films, which happened to peak in the same year, and the sillier, childlike tone that almost every prior entry in the genre had subscribed to. Nicholson's Joker is considered cartoonish nowadays, but just 19 years before Robert Downey Jr. donned the iron suit for the first time, it was seen as a much darker version of what comic book films could represent. Despite dealing with terrorists and some of the heavier elements that the series has tackled, Iron Man is mostly music and vibes, and a lot of people still hold it in understandably high regard, despite the Dark Knight going on to steal most of the limelight. It was an exciting idea that promised to start something interesting, though nobody could really be sure what. And then, just over a month later, came The Incredible Hulk. Now, I actually like this film, but it's a clear step down by comparison to its predecessor. It didn't really hit any of the right notes, despite having Ed Norton and Tim Roth go head to head in what should have been a really interesting conflict that still had room for a big monster showdown at the end. There's so much to be done with the one superhero who really doesn't want to be what he is, particularly in those early stages before he learned to control his anger for plot convenience. However, what we got was middling at best, and didn't exactly herald in a horde of Marvel movies. We didn't get another MCU entry for almost 2 years, which didn't happen again until the gap between Far From Home and Black Widow. But that was after they finished off an 11-year story chronicling the rise of a foe that threatened the entire universe, and was also from mid-2019 to 2021, when there were other things. The quality, or lack thereof, of 2010's Iron Man 2 was yet another setback, and Thor was only just visually and thematically interesting enough to suggest that the MCU would ever really evolve beyond the realms of the many series that had previously trodden similar paths. There was a great initial entry, 2 regrettable follow-ups, and this weird 4th film that didn't really do much to capture the essence of what Iron Man had managed. But on the other hand, profit, and therefore 2 months after Thor, however, everything changed for the MCU, because on the 22nd of July 2011 we got Captain America, the First Avenger, which ushered in a much different age, one which pretty consistently delivered high quality films for the next 3 or 4 years, each of which offered us something different to the rest. We got a new, honourable hero and wartime period drama laced with enough science fiction and action to spice up its romantic heart, an epic ensemble that raised the stakes and gave us our first, and most expertly realised, look at the advantages of teaming up different heroes and creating friction between a group of characters who had each starred in their own standalone films. An introspective look at a character in series struggling with the inability to live up to something as momentous as their own greatest achievement. Whatever this film was trying to do, a spy thriller that managed to bring the Avengers back to their human roots whilst delivering the most interesting action sequences the franchise has seen, and the unadulterated interstellar sci-fi comedy of Guardians of the Galaxy. Though, more on that in a moment. Every new release was an interesting and exciting adventure where you weren't sure how it would entertain you, only that it would. There seemed a good balance of characters, with a nice number of returning figures, both heroes and villains, to accompany those that were new and offered some element that hadn't been explored or discovered thus far. I remember discussing that ratio with a friend at the time, when it first became clear that there were big plans in place for the MCU, and decided that they would have to start killing off or otherwise getting rid of characters before it was too late. They simply couldn't keep adding more people without disrupting the coherent dynamic that had been laid down by the first 6 years of the franchise. That Age of Ultron trailer with the broken Captain America shield misled me into believing that they might actually be aware of that. Alas, they were not. And by 2019, when they finally had the guts to sacrifice some fringe characters and put out a couple of big hitters with some predictably milquetoast story threads, it was already 4 or 5 years too late. By Endgame, the series' major characters alone consisted of Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Black Widow, Hulk, Hawkeye, Nick Fury, Loki, Scarlet Witch, Spider-Man, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Captain Marvel, Ant-Man, Star-Lord, Rocket Raccoon, Groot, Gamora, Drax, Mantis, Thanos, Vision, Falcon, War Machine, the Winter Soldier, Wasp, Valkyrie, and several others. And unlike with The Wire, for instance, we didn't get the outstanding level of focus, ambition, or simply stellar quality of writing to justify such an ensemble. Before I even knew what was to come, I was worried about the likelihood of repetition and oversaturation that would inherently arise from introducing new characters and adding them in as yet another to keep track of. The films would inevitably become too formulaic, a fear that began to manifest as reality in Stage 3. The cracks appear. Guardians of the Galaxy, and the subsequent disappointment of Age of Ultron, was perhaps the biggest turning point for the MCU. Prior films had mostly been grounded in earthly conflicts with a certain rust and aesthetic. Even the aliens who came through a giant sky portal to invade Earth back in 2012 were largely in keeping with the surroundings, and the black and grey colour scheme of the matte and metallic blend lent a more meaningful atmosphere to the events taking place on the screen. But Guardians of the Galaxy brought a litany of one-liners, pop culture references, and CGI colour explosions to the fore, and would go on to become the template for the majority of the entries in the series. Age of Ultron was billed as the next big thing, but it cost $170 million more to make, and $145 million more than the previous Avengers film, which outperformed it by more than $100 million. I hate breaking down films this way, but there's a reason I'm doing it so much for this particular super franchise. Anyway, Age of Ultron was much less warmly received than intended, and after Ant-Man, which I don't think was on anyone's mind either way, Marvel's Phase 2 came to a close, and left Feige and co. with a lot to think about. Despite making a lot more money than James Gunn's galactic romp, the second entry in the Avengers ensemble films had a much smaller cultural impact, and is remembered a lot less fondly today, which should never have been the case because it was designed to be Marvel's biggest hit yet, and was up against a quirky tale about a bunch of random characters that most of us normies had never previously heard of. Disney clearly decided that, rather than dark conflicts and emotionally tolling battles, the people would rather see aliens and green screens topped off with jokes crammed in wherever they can sort of fit, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but remember when I mentioned my fears of oversaturation? Well, yeah. To demonstrate this divide, I would argue that Guardians of the Galaxy is the only film in the first two of Marvel's phases that fits this all-computer-generated, comedic and colourful style. Yet in the third phase, the films that stand out are those that broke free from this mould, such as Black Panther, which very clearly has its own identity and a villain that wasn't evil or all that wrong. Just looking at the posters alone, we see a huge shift in tone. We go from the darker, moodier films that sought to present themselves as adult-friendly entertainment, to this, where everything is shinier and lighter, to the point where even the one film that tried to pitch itself as the darkest thing to happen to the franchise is still lit up like a Christmas tree in comparison to those that tried dealing with real-world themes back in the late noughties and early 2010s. Yes, there are attempts to put a sinister edge on things later on, but Iron Man's qualms about the consequences of his actions never had the same punch as Steve struggling to be a figure of hope and positivity after losing everyone and everything that he had ever loved, or Tony's own trauma and obsession that resulted from the time he so nearly saw his short life blink out, and the fact that he then had to come to terms with the idea that the one good thing he's ever done for anyone else will ultimately end up killing him, one way or another. Stage 3 saw James Gunn's template applied to more and more of the movies, with some not doing anything interesting whatsoever, and the subsequent fatigue from the increased number weighing down even those that did. Other than Black Panther, which itself descended into typical Marvel cartoon fighting at times, the most unique of the post-Guardians films is arguably Thor Ragnarok, which divides a lot of fans and seems to stand out in people's rankings for better or for worse. But even that film is just doing the same as all the others, but more. The quips are quirkier, the heroes hardier, and the screen is green as the greenest of screens, but piling more of these on top doesn't actually constitute trying something new. It felt impossible to keep up, particularly as there didn't seem to be much incentive to work so hard for such little rewards, and by the time that Infinity War was here, and someone finally decided to do things a little differently, I, and many others, weren't all that invested in a series that had once felt deserving of its position as the apex of fun flicks. But kids' films inherently sell twice as many tickets, and a new audience funded the audacity that Feige's franchise now wielded like a weapon. The last non-COVID affected Marvel film that didn't break $1 billion at the box office alone was Ant-Man and the Wasp, which came out back in the summer of 2018, when I was still in school and you were... I don't know, but something's probably changed quite dramatically for you. And $1 billion is a buttload of money. Only 6 films that were released before the franchise began had ever reached that milestone, and several of those needed re-releases to help them over that line. 5 of the top 12 highest grossing films are a part of the MCU, and 2019's Avengers Endgame was briefly in the #1 spot until Avatar was re-released to take back the pole position earlier this year. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because Endgame was only such a success thanks to the ending of 2018's Infinity War, which is where we entered Stage 4, the Dead Horse. Before I get into this stage, and why it was deserving of its own spot separate from Stage 3, I'm going to have to warn you about major spoilers for Infinity War and Endgame. If you somehow avoided them thus far, I'm going to guess you don't care, but it's still important to give you that heads up. Alright, so, at the end of Infinity War, everyone dies. Well, no. But the big bad Thanos accumulates these 6 rocks that allow him to destroy half of all life in existence, so that we don't deplete the universe's finite resources. I mean, population-wise, he only set us back to 1973, so hardly a permanent fix from a guy who was in a position to double resource production for the rest of time, but whatever. Anyway, this would have been a pretty cool cliffhanger, and an even cooler point to end the franchise, although we all knew that wasn't going to happen. But there was always the hope that the surviving heroes wouldn't simply find an easy and convenient fix in the upcoming Avengers Endgame, and that this moment, in which people watch those that they love drift away into dust, would actually mean something and have genuine, lasting consequence. Or at least there would have been, if Spider-Man, who was the focus of the most prominent attempt to squeeze feeling out of the audience in this dire moment, hadn't already had his next film confirmed, which we knew wouldn't be a prequel because the dude was supposed to be 18 at the time, and we've already seen his rise from awkward teen to international superhero in full detail. Even as they were trying to make us cry by killing him off, they were lining their pockets by reassuring us that he would be alive in his next film and that it was coming soon. The relentless profit machine that powers the MCU interfered with its story in the most depressing way possible, literally sucking every semblance of meaning out of what should have been the series' greatest moment for the sake of advertising dollars. I know that more or less all films are about profit for somebody, but this just seemed soulless from the get-go. And as Endgame unfolded, it became clear that, rather than finally rounding off the films after 20-something entries, this would simply be another step along the way, and there would be no sense of finality allowed as the train kept rolling on down to, and beyond, San Antonio. San Antonio in this metaphor is the point where they should have brought the MCU to a close, but refused, eradicating any hope that I had that the franchise still harboured some belief in creative vision, rather than simply scraping every last penny from the world's biggest cash cow.
He seems to be mixing metaphors.
Good and bad gave way to a blend of anger and melancholy, which made me apathetic about everything going on. I didn't care about Endgame's plot holes, and I didn't care about the moment I've been waiting for since the prospect first crossed my mind back in 2012. Everything had been replaced by my reaction to the final nail in the coffin. But wait, there's more, because although I have to admit that I've only watched one of the Phase 4 films, Black Widow, it was the least inspired MCU film I've ever seen, which is really saying something after the last 7 years or so. It had a really promising cast, and seemed to be tapping into some fun characters, as well as returning to a more human elements and grounded approach, well, relatively speaking. but it felt like a parody of those films that had offered so much more, starting out by trying to be a Bourne thing, which I thought we'd moved past a few years back, to be honest, and only going downhill from there. It made its way back to silly sci-fi with some of the worst green screen that's been allowed since the dawn of the 21st century, and the characters' action and set pieces were all blunted midway through the second act when what little interest I had was thrown out of the window with the introduction of, well, a lot of elements, really. The pacing was torn to shreds as we got a slog of information spewed out by Ray Winston's character, and whilst the one interesting concept of being physically unable to hurt the villain seemed like a rejection of the typical structure of the films, that was taken away with little reasoning so that everything could be fine and dandy as per usual. They even did one of those slow piano covers of a late 20th century pop song that seemed to plague every film or trailer, or toothpaste advert these days. And it was even worse than usual because it was one of those slow piano covers with Smells Like Teen Spirit, which, particularly given its use and the company behind said use, entirely flies in the face of the meaning of that song. I laughed when I heard it, but then I was just sad, because everything about it is so irredeemably terrible, and now I don't know where I am. We're a decent way into the 2020s, and the MCU started 13 years ago, when I was just a little kid. I feel like it will keep marching its pretty inevitable march for a long time yet. I mean, back in 2014, when Spain were the World Cup holders and everyone was terrified of Ebola, they already had plans to be releasing films in 2028. If that rate has continued, they'll currently have plans for 2036, when we'll be 24 years into the franchise. The rate only seems to be increasing too, as, if all goes according to plan, they'll have released 10 Phase 4 films by July 2023, just 2 years after Phase 4 actually began. When you throw in every TV show and wider expansion of the Marvel story that would inevitably arise, it would be far too much for any one person, and I'll have checked out a long time ago. And now I just feel empty, and I don't know what to say. I really ran out of steam, thinking about the future, and to be honest, I just want to go and watch Gravity Falls. Anyway, a big thanks to everyone who made it through this whole thing, and as always, if you have any thoughts on the series, or on this video, I look forward to reading them in the comments below. If you think I'm an idiot and that the new films are way better, let me know why. But if you enjoyed this, I'd really appreciate a like, as it helps me to know what kind of stuff people are interested in, and really helps me to keep motivated in working on the channel. And with all of that out of the way, I will say goodbye for now, and see you next time.